Sacred Heart is proud to sponsor Pensacola Histories in recognition of the Daughters of Charity who brought their mission of care to Pensacola over 90 years ago.
Hello and welcome to our continuing story of Pensacola, North America's first place city. Today we're dealing with the second episode of our tale of how religion has evolved here in Pensacola. Last time we left our story as the church leadership was locking the door, and all of the parishioners and the clergy itself were retreating as people fled from Pensacola as the federal troops were about to occupy it in 1862. Of course, the war ended, and people slowly began to come back. And naturally, one of the problems that they all had as they came back, there was a almost total absence of money. Trying to restore the churches, repair the damage that might have been done during 3 years of absence. This took place a step at a time, but happily, there was no serious damage to any of the churches except the Methodist Church on Tarragona Street. That, of course, was not a war casualty. The damage, the destruction of the little church occurred because some children began to play alongside of it, and somehow or other, they either playing with matches or something like that, they set a fire, and the grass there was blown. The fire was blown through the grass. It attacked the church, and it burned to the ground. So the Methodists had to start over. But by the time we move into the early part of the 1870s, all of these churches are doing well. Now, the Catholic Church, which had never had a true church building of its own, finally had the funds together, and they built their own new church very close to the downtown plaza. But unfortunately, within just a couple of years, it burned. And so the story, they went back to meeting once again in a warehouse. So we move into the 1870s, and now things do begin to change. By the time we reach 1876, there is a small and growing Jewish community here. And these folks come together, they pool their resources, and while they did not have the funding to employ a full-time rabbi at the time, one of their members served in that role, and they built what we today would call the first version of Temple Bethel. This was built on the south side of Chase Street in the first block off of Palace Fox Street. The temple there was built of wood. It served the congregation there into the 1890s when fire destroyed that building, and it was replaced with a new brick synagogue at the same site, and that synagogue again served in that particular location for 30 years. When again fire attacked it, it burned to the ground, and the Jewish community built the third version of Temple Bethel, which still stands at the corner of Cervantes and Mobile Highway. 4 years later, something rather unique happened. A young man by the name of John Pfeiffer, whose family had been in Pensacola for the last 45 years, was about to be married. And his bride was from Mobile. And so as they gathered for the prenuptial ceremonies over in that city, the pastor there asked John Pfeiffer, well, why don't you have a Lutheran church in Pensacola? And Pfeiffer said, well, I guess we've never quite gotten the act together. And so that was the spark. And so these people organized, they raised funds, they purchased property, and that property was on the corner of Garden Street and Balin, about where the Regions Bank parking lot is today. And they built a very lovely church there, and that served them for about 25 years when they chose to relocate and built the new church, which is on the corner of Balin and Wright Street. About the same time, the Methodists were beginning to have problems. This is now 1880. It's a very tumultuous time because the lumbering era has begun, the railroad has been put in place, and Pensacola is a growing city. And the Methodist chapel, the one that was rebuilt right after the war, was on Tarragona Street, which of course was the direct line where the railroad tracks ran from the railroad depot all the way down to the port. Now, I don't know what the answer was, but the story, we wrote about that in this little book here that was done a few years ago for the Methodist Church. We tried to find an answer of why, but we never did. But in some way, the leaders of the Methodist Church and the engineers on the railroad became at odds. And so basically what would happen was on a Wednesday night during prayer meeting, by some rare coincidence, of course, a switch engine would arrive and park right outside the church. And while the service was in progress inside, the engine bell would ring, the whistle would blow, the steam would hiss out. And that was bad enough. And then, of course, the same thing would happen during Sunday morning services. And finally, the Methodists, who felt, well, maybe we've outgrown this little building anyway, they said, we're going to move. And so they purchased what had been a chicken farm right on the corner of Palafox and Garden Street. And that was where they erected their brand new, beautiful brick church with a pastorium, which was just to the north of it. And of course, this was on the site which one day would become the San Carlos Hotel. Well, okay. As all of this was going on, the Catholic Church finally was about to make a move. And at this point in time, of course, the city is now beginning to move north. By the time we get to 1880, 81, 82, this is when North Hill begins to be populated, when fine new homes are being erected. And a number of the Catholic parishioners, of course, are a part of that movement. And now the priest at the time finally decided, well, it makes no sense to build a new church down in the southern part of the city because the growth is going to be to the north. And so he arranged for the purchase of property north of where the Methodists had built their church. And this, of course, is on the Palafox Street at the corner of Chase. And the story of how he did it, of course, is contained in this little booklet here. It was a beautiful church. It was designed by an architect named William Overman, and the construction was by the Turner Construction Company. And people at the time thought that the cost was outrageous because it cost $33,000 to build that church. And of course, that beautiful St. Michael's Church is still in use today. The only difference today is that it was stuccoed in between 1885 and the present time, so that the exterior finish is different. But basically, they have been true to maintaining the ambience that the original architect had, and it is a beautiful, beautiful church. Well, about the same time, just a year or so later, the Presbyterians felt they had outgrown their little church on Intendencia Street, so they went through the same kind of exercise. They sent a committee about, that studied how churches were being built in the South, and they purchased property on, that's not correct. They were given property by the Simpson family on Chase Street, exactly across the street where Temple Bethel stood. And in 1887, they completed their church, which again is covered in this little story here, the story of the Presbyterian Church. It was a beautiful building. And of course, the Presbyterians have a Scottish background, and they like to think that they do things with the fiscal conservatism. Their church cost about $13,000 to build, and I suspect that the elders drew their hands together thinking how much less it had cost them than it had the Catholics. Well, just a couple of years later, of course, the Baptists got into the same act. They purchased property up on the hill, just below the height of Lee Square, and they erected their new church, which would serve them well into the 1950s. At the same time, the Episcopal Church people are beginning to get a little bit concerned. They said, we have got to do something because we've been down here at Old Christ Church for all these years. Our parishioners are moving north. We have to do something that's a little bit better. So they began to develop a search team, and this was led primarily by Mrs. Henry Bars. She was the one that really was the fiscal leader of this, the promoter of it, and they acquired property on the corner of Wright Street and Palafox and built what the church then, of course, called the New Christ Church, and indeed it was put in place and first occupied for services in 1903. Now, while all of this has been going on, while the Methodists, the Baptists, the Presbyterians, all of them have been building, another church came into being which was extremely important here for almost 30 years. That was built by a combination of the city of Pensacola, the city government, and the Norwegian government itself. In other words, by the time we get into the mid-1880s, our lumbering era is in high gear, and there are something like 50 to 60 vessels a month coming in here to pick up cargoes of lumber going to Europe. And most of those, not all, but most of those vessels were handled by crews of Scandinavian men, and virtually all of them were Lutheran. And now these people were here not just a day or two, as what might be the case in modern day shipping. They might be here 2, 3, 4 weeks in the transit of discharging the ballast and then loading a new cargo. So these men needed a home away from home. And so the Norwegian government and the city of Pensacola cooperated and built what was known as the Norwegian Seamen's Church. It was on South Palafox Street, about a block and a half up from the waterfront. It was a lovely church. It unfortunately burned once in the course of its life, but was rebuilt and enlarged somewhat. And it was totally successful as a home for these many seamen. And it has one tradition that we want to recall in it. This was certainly unique. But after a few years, the process for these men developed so that people back home knew where these men were going to be for Christmas. And so any little Christmas gift that they wanted to send would be sent in care of the Norwegian Seamen's Church. And 2 nights before Christmas, there would be a grand celebration in the church, and our town's leadership and the city government would be there to help. It was wonderful. They'd have a big dinner down there. The seamen would open their presents, and then after they were finished, these men would walk back down to the waterfront, get in their ship's boats. They would put lanterns on them, and they would begin to row back and forth along the waterfront, singing their native Christmas carols. And of course, the whole town would turn out to see it. And this was a custom that endured here for almost 20 years. And as far as I know, it's the only place in the whole United States where such a custom proceeded. Well, as we move toward the beginning of the 21st century, the movement into North Hill and a little bit into East Hill was beginning, and so at that point in time, a group from the Methodist Church felt that they needed to have something a little more convenient for themselves. So, with the assistance of the Methodist Conference out of the Carolinas, they obtained permission and then funding, and they built what they called a Sunday school on the east side along 9th Avenue. Just off of 9th Avenue, and they used that, of course, as a Sunday school. And of course, when the Board of Education saw this, they said, "Well, that's only being used a few hours on Sunday. Could we use this as a school?" And so they kind of cooperated together. And ultimately, after just a year or so, it went beyond being a Sunday school and was classified as a church. A new building was built on the corner of Jackson and 9th Avenue, and this became the Jackson and Gadsden, and this became the Gadsden Street Methodist Church, which of course is still with us today. Now, about the same time, other churches were beginning to go into what we would today call the missionary movement. The Presbyterians, for example, began to put together what we would call Sunday schools, and they were at Millview, at Muskogee. One was built down on the waterfront for sailors, and this movement was very successful, and ultimately led to the foundation, the creation of a new Presbyterian church on the east side, and this ultimately became the McElwain Presbyterian Church. It had several names before that, Knox Presbyterian and others, but it was the direct outgrowth of the Sunday school missionary movement that took place that way. About the same time, many of these churches, of course, took up the idea of foreign missions, and a number of the men who were clergy in all of these churches about this time became very much involved in the missionary movement itself. Now, at the turn of the 20th century, we had here about 30 churches altogether. Now, the many beyond the ones that I've described in these 2 episodes. There were 17 that were for white parishioners and 12 that were for colored, and they were all very successful at the time. And as time has gone forward, of course, this whole thing has evolved in many, many different ways. As the community has grown, the churches have grown. Today, if you pick up your current telephone book and go back to the segment there called churches, you're going to find not just 25 or 30 church lists, you're going to find literally hundreds there, and there are many others that are so small that they do not have a directory listing. But basically, the evolution of religion has been part of our story from beginning to end. There have been peaks and valleys, such as I mentioned earlier with the Oxford movement, and what we are going through today, well, we can't describe yet whether there's another peak or a valley, but nonetheless, the church has been with us all the way through, a great source of comfort, and in difficult times helped so much with the poor. That is our story of religion.